So I think it is, unfortunately, that we're going to see more of the iron fist now, cracking down, particularly if protests get more violent.
Now, Donald Trump says the US is locked and loaded and ready to go if Iran cracks down on protests in the country. Iran's responded by saying American bases in the region would be legitimate targets if the nation intervenes. At least 6 people are reported to have been killed yesterday after almost a week of mass protests sparked by worsening economic conditions.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!
The protests began on Sunday with shopkeepers venting their anger at another sharp fall in the value of the Iranian currency, the rial, against the US dollar. By Tuesday, university students were involved and the protests spread to several cities. We can speak now to Rob McCare, who's a former UK ambassador to Iran, and Dr. Sanam Vakil, who's the director of the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House. Welcome both and thanks for joining me. Let's start with what Trump said this morning. If Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. Dr. Vakil, how likely do you think US intervention might be?
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me. This is certainly a new position from Donald Trump. The U.S. administration has, in many rounds of previous Iranian protests, tried to support protesters, but also made clear that they would not directly intervene, as any political change should certainly come through the work and volition of Iranians themselves and shouldn't echo past American efforts of involvement dating back 50, 75, or 100 years of interference in Iran's domestic politics. So this is a new effort perhaps to pressure the Iranian system and perhaps to maybe empower protesters at the same time. But I think this sort of commentary could be dangerous for all sides. Certainly ordinary Iranians are feeling emboldened and going out on the streets, risking their own lives. It would be important that they also be careful, because the Islamic Republic has repeatedly cracked down on protests. It has been no stranger to these sort of protests in the past, and I certainly worry about the life and longer-term livelihood of these young people out there.
Rob, as a former ambassador to Iran, do you agree? What do you think the best course of action would be for President Trump?
Yeah, I do agree. Thanks very much, Dom. I think Sanam is right about this completely. And although no one would want to predict confidently what President Trump is going to do ever, it does feel like this is the sort of saber rattling that tries to encourage people in Iran to put pressure on their regime and tries to hasten regime change. And it doesn't feel very likely to succeed. I think if you're being cynical about it, you'd say the best thing that President Trump could do to help the regime would be to loose off a few missiles at regime targets, because that would simply make it look as if these protests are part of an international conspiracy to overthrow the regime, which is how the regime will always want to portray these sorts of demonstrations. And clearly they're spontaneous and they're the result of huge frustration, initially economically, but as with each round of protests, so with these ones, we've seen the initial spark then leading to a wider bandwagon of people joining, because people are so frustrated with the regime itself. So I don't think that it's very difficult to see how US military intervention or any other forms of intervention could really help the protesters, and it might well indeed lead people to be a bit more cautious about joining in. So I think it is the US can't really threaten much more economic pressure, because it's already at a maximum pressure policy on Iran. So quite hard to see how outside players can physically support the protesters. But obviously it's very important that the West shows that we are on the side of people who are protesting legitimately against a regime that is utterly lacking in legitimacy and failing to deliver for its people.
As you said, these protests started regarding the soaring cost of living. Why has Iran's economy changed so much recently?
Well, it's not just because of sanctions, but obviously that plays a significant role in the pressure on the economy. There's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of mismanagement. And one of the things that sanctions do is they distort the economy. So it is, you do see that the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, tend to have more control over oil smuggling and other import and export routes under this heavy sanctions burden, which diverts more money towards the regime and away from the sort of middle class private sector that maybe would provide a more moderate alternative pole of attraction inside the country. But it is, I think what to remember is that this government came in on a platform of economic reform. They said they were going to deliver better economic results for the people. And on the one hand, that would be about getting an agreement with the West that lifts sanctions. But on the other hand, there were a lot of promises there about what the government would do for ordinary people, and the cost of living has just gone up. Inflation's gone up, food inflation 72% compared to last year, and the currency has dropped in value by more than a half over the last 6 months. So, it's because the government has been promising economic reform and it's just got worse that I think people feel, this regime is not delivering anything for us.
Dr. Vakil, you've written about women and politics in Iran, and of course many of the past protests have been fighting against the morality police, enforced hijab wearing. So considering this is a protest against economic conditions, or started off with it, how different is this in comparison to past protests?
Well, these protests do bear some similarities to, as of right now, protests that we saw in 2017, 2018, and another round that broke out in the winter of 2019. These protests share in similarity the economic nature and the quick spread of the protests to smaller towns and cities across the country. And in those small towns and cities, what we are witnessing now and what we saw then were small crowds coming together to chant. These crowds also becoming violent, maybe trying to attack government buildings, and security forces trying to simultaneously overwhelm these groups and these crowds at the same time. Protests for the time being have come to an end in the larger cities. In Tehran, for example, it is a Friday, so everything is closed more or less, and we'll have to see how things continue. I think from the government perspective, they're trying to inject some new tactics to these protests. The government, Pezeshkian, the president, has tried to reach out to the protesters, to the strikers, those leading the economic protests, to try to quote unquote negotiate. At the same time, the government does need to address and manage the subsidies that continue to drain the balance sheet, if you will. So what does come next from the government side will be an effort to try to placate protesters, control the violence, and simultaneously engage in subsidy reform that is necessary while the Iranian economy is contracting, and the Iranian government does not have access to liquidity abroad. So it's a tricky dynamic for them. Increased loss of life or increased violence is going to attract that international attention, and President Trump pretends to be watching.
Rob McKay, Iran's Prosecutor General Mohammad Movaheedi Azad warned that any attempt to create instability will be met with what he called a decisive response, whilst President Masoud Pezeshkian has said his government will listen to the legitimate demands of the protesters. Two conflicting points there. What do you expect the Iranian government's response to be?
I think that you've seen this very clear attempt by the authorities to make a distinction between the economic protesters, particularly the traders and shopkeepers who've come out and who started this, from what they call destructive elements. And we will see this dual approach of trying to crack down on violence and at the same time find ways to appease the broader underlying concerns that are out there, and that's not new in Iran. I think the regime has, as Sanam was saying, has seen a lot of protests over recent years, and it's always tried to manage it in both those ways, and it's tried to distinguish between the legitimate voice of people protesting and the so-called sort of violent elements. And the truth is that it's not quite that simple, because if you look at the social media and you look at the interviews with the small traders who started this, they're all incredibly fed up with the regime. They're not regime loyalists who are just saying they want a couple of measures changed. Everyone is just fed up with the inability of the regime to deliver. So I think it is, unfortunately, that we're going to see more of the iron fist now, cracking down, particularly if protests get more violent. But at the same time, there will be this attempt to try to drive a wedge inside the protest movement.
And just briefly, both of you, how likely do you think it is that we see American intervention?
I would say I hesitate to predict what President Trump will do, but I think not very likely, because it's very hard to see how they could do anything that would be useful in the circumstances.
Dr. Vakil?
I share Rob's assessment. I think it's highly unlikely, and this doesn't fit within the mandate of President Trump's America First foreign policy. So rhetorical support and perhaps using this as an opportunity to actually accomplish what he says he wants to accomplish, which is a deal with the Islamic Republic.
Interesting times ahead. Thank you very much for joining me. Rob McCare, a former UK ambassador to Iran, and Dr. Sanam Vakil, the director of the Middle East and North Africa programme at Chatham House.